Harry, how come right-wing populist movements seem to be succeeding all the way around the world these days, and transnational movements of progressive people like you and me are having a hard time and often declining? Well, I'm going to have a conversation with John Feffer about that topic. In fact, he initiated the call. He wants to talk to me about it because he's thinking and writing about it. And I thought, well, let's record this while we're at it. And John is the director of the Foreign Policy in Focus publication at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. He's an old friend. We met at the Helsinki Citizens Assembly conferences many years ago at the end of the Cold War and the beginning of what has turned out to be a very puzzling historical period. So I've asked John, he asked me what my theory was about the cause of this movement of right-wing populism. And I threw the question back to him. What is your theory, John?
So my theory is, that, you have three kind of overlapping concerns. The first is that economic globalization hasn't benefited evenly, either across the world or within countries. And there are a lot of folks who are threatened by it. And obviously there are people who in working class or the working poor who have not benefited, but it's actually the middle class that is most anxious about the impact of globalization as they see both their incomes decline relatively over the last 20 years, but also the benefits they come to expect, health, education for their children. And this has created a sense of great precariousness among middle class in many countries. So that's one. The second is that these economic policies are generally supported by both major parties, the center left and the center right, whether the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States.
I mean, the globalizing economic policies.
Yeah. Or the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats in Europe. So there's been a great erosion of support for the mainstream parties, in part because of their support for economic globalization, but also, and this is another kind of major factor in the rise of the populist right, corruption. Members of both major parties have been embroiled in corruption scandals of one sort or another throughout the world, particularly in Latin America, but you can find it in, obviously, Africa, but even here in the United States. So corruption becomes a major political byword. And then the third is the kind of set of social issues that the populist right has really used to fuel their rise. Immigration, of course, number one, but also multiculturalism more generally, a suspicion that global elites are interested in challenging the privileges, if you will, of the majority, but also minority rights more generally, LGBT in particular, but also other minority groups asserting their rights. And so a backlash against that. If you take all three of those together, you can explain, I think, the rise of almost all of the populist leaders from Eastern Europe through Latin America to Duterte in the Philippines. So that would be my kind of interlocking explanation for why these folks have been so successful. I mean, what I'm looking at in this project is not just the rise of the populist right, but their increased connectivity across borders. And in other words, their transnational project.
That's new to me.
Yeah.
Because I don't. Well, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah. Well, I sent you, I think maybe there's a link to the article I published a couple months ago. So that kind of looks at the efforts at a variety of levels of the right and the far right to link up across borders, both heads of government, heads of parties, um, activists like Steve Bannon, but also social organizations, very conservative organizations that have set up campaigns in many, many countries against, same-sex marriage, against transgender education, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, at the digital realm, and the kind of the rise of the dark web and the organizing that takes place among the far right that leads to some of the kind of manifestos and lone wolf shootings that we see in New Zealand or most recently in the United States. So it's obviously not something that's centralized or particularly well organized, but nevertheless there are lots of different transnational efforts going on, and the article that I'm working on now is kind of looking at that and the response by the left, and what's missing essentially, which is kind of what I wanted to focus on with our conversation, because we've been involved in a number of transnational efforts, and over the years, dating back, obviously to the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, but even before that. And, it seemed for a while that, our internationalism would simply grow stronger, both expand and become deeper. We would have, the World Social Forum. We would have, the Occupy movement. All of these kind of transnational efforts. And yet, right now, it seems as if there's less of it, which is the paradox, because of course we face these, pressing international problems.
Yeah. Now you're speaking exactly to my grievance.
Yeah.
I just think that is the most amazing thing. Just when it's clear that almost all of the world's problems are really global and can't be solved at a national level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's all we get is a rise of nationalism.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm trying to kind of understand, why that is the case. And I wanted to, just to talk with you a little bit about why you think that's the case. What happened to our efforts?
I remain really baffled. I mean, I of course, all of the three things that you've mentioned are things a lot of people have mentioned. You're not unique in account. So I can look at some incidents that I think explain, well, everybody would see, that explain what's going on in terms of I think, clampdown on transnationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the fact that, oddly, even though the Congress is doing nothing to try to really punish Russia for this troll factory in St. Petersburg and all the good, successes they had,
Mm-hmm.
they seem to be allowing that to go forward. Nevertheless, there is on the other hand, a sense of, I think, sort of panic that, my God, somebody might get control of our government. And so we've got to talk about privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the word privacy comes up as a major concern for people,
Mm-hmm.
as if, they never thought about privacy before, but now all of a sudden they're worried about personal data being used against them in some way, or at least in ways that they wouldn't countenance, like helping Trump get elected.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that, but this reaction of, well, Congress has tried to interrogate Facebook and others. And I guess Europe has done a better job of it. They've actually imposed real limits on what they can do. And even in Canada, there's a new, some kind of quiet thing. I'm not sure whether it's done by the PMO or Parliament, but because it didn't get much attention. But they put some limits on what Facebook and Twitter and so on can do in Canada. They said, well, from now on, you can only boost, that is, pay to advertise your videos or anything else that has any social or political content, social issues or political issues, only inside your own country. So there is no way I can talk about certain things. And so I always put them up and I say, now I apply to have it advertised. And they don't know what they're doing. What is the social issue? Well, hell, I mean, talking about whether electric vehicles are better than fuel cell vehicles. That's a social issue and it's not acceptable. And then they started, the Canadian government came in with some kind of regulation, and they said now to post anything, even inside Canada, you have to be registered and approved, and you have to, get your, you have to prove you're a decent human being. So they is really elaborate, and I have never succeeded in finishing the application because it keeps getting changed. And then, but what we did find is in small print someplace in one of these many pages of documentation on Facebook, they have a clause saying that if you are a really well-established publication, you can be exempted from some of these rules, which I hope means that I could actually broadcast my tainted and political tree planting videos, etc., worldwide. I don't know. It's important for this purpose to send it out as Peace Magazine and to establish that Peace Magazine has existed for 38 years or something. And I don't know what rules have affected you.
Well, I don't. I haven't applied to boost or to boost videos or content. So I haven't tested that. But I mean, this is interesting. I mean, there's obviously you're caught up in something that it wasn't intended to restrict your dissemination, but I think was, there's been a real proliferation of far-right content in videos that has been boosted, all around the world, and that has led, to some very serious negative consequences. The worst, of course, are the shooters who are using, these platforms to spread their messages. But the other irony, of course, is that many of these far right-wing actors are being deplatformed. That's the term they use. They're being kicked off of Facebook, being kicked off of Twitter, but they simply have set up their own independent distribution systems, their own independent platforms. So, so that the terrible irony is that the very regulations that you have to go through to ensure that the far right is not, using Facebook and Twitter for these purposes. Well, the far right no longer uses Facebook and Twitter. They've established their own independent platform. So that's.
What is that, Chan 8? I keep seeing a reference to that, and
yeah, 8chan.
8chan.
It's just it's what used to be known as a bulletin board, but it's now it has a web presence, and it's just an opportunity for people to post content and comment on content. But even 8chan is somewhat mainstream compared to what now exists. There are completely separate dark web chat opportunities and messaging opportunities. Like there's something called Gab.I, which is used almost exclusively by the far right. So I'm sorry, again, to hear about all of these challenges to the work you want to do. But I want to, get back to this question of what you think has happened, to more generally, not just specifically in terms of the difficulty of connecting transnationally in this project, but what do you think, why do you think things like the Helsinki Citizens Assembly or the World Social Forum have not continued or gotten stronger, but in fact over the years have gotten weaker, even as we need more international cooperation?
Well, I was hoping you'd explain it to me. Truly, everywhere I go, I ask that very question. If I give a dinner party, before we get through the soup, everybody's got to answer my question. How come this is happening? Why? I don't know. I know that it's really hard to deal with Russia. For example, there's a woman named Jill Carr Harris who, with her husband Rajagopal, are the two of the main Gandhian organizers in India. She's Canadian, but she's lived there many years. And he organized 5 years ago a huge march from, I don't know, let's say from Bombay to Delhi or something like that. It wasn't that, but that distance. For 100,000 landless peasants. And it's a beautiful thing to watch on video because it's amazing. They're so different in their way. They look so different from our demonstrators or anything. They march along with a little flag around, or a little bandana around their neck, and carrying some sort of post, thing, sign, and very disciplined and very orderly and impressive. And they had to plan 2 years in advance to get that thing to happen. These peasants had to save up one handful of rice every day for the time they're going to be away, and 1 rupee, or I think it's 10 rupees or something, they would put in a pot so that when 2 years later, they could afford to leave town and have their families still fed, Yeah. So these people marched, I think it was months, across the country. And before they got to Delhi, the Minister of Agriculture came out to meet them because they were demanding a piece of land, promised each person would get a little piece of land. And he gave them everything they asked for. So, big success. So what they're doing now on October the 2nd, which is Gandhi's 150th birthday, they will leave from Delhi and march a year to reach Geneva a year later. And there will be 100 of them who will march the whole way, and they think thousands others who will join them part of the way. And when they get to Geneva, they will be joined by streams of other marchers coming from other parts of Europe and North Africa. And we'll spend a week together in Geneva with meetings and whatnot. Well, there was a time when a few months ago when they are in touch with they of course go around and talk to the presidents of all these countries, trying to get permission to march through their country and even help with things like trucks or whatever, carry their belongings. And so she talked to the president of Armenia, who's on good terms with Putin, and he said, you're coming through Abkhazia, so you're only about 20 miles from Sochi, because on this side of the border, why don't you march to Sochi and get a conference set up there in, in Sochi, some sort of peace conference, and then, march on from there. And so they thought, okay. And so she came to me, asked me to help find people in Russia who would be open to hosting or at least participating or somehow okaying such a meeting in Sochi. Well, I got in touch with some of the people who connected with the Olympics because, that was the last thing they did there. And Russia has been excluded from the Olympics and they would like back in. So if the IOC authorized such a thing, Russia would be extremely glad, I think, to include in the program or invite participation from former athletes or people who had been there. So I talked to a guy here in Canada who's the leading person, former Olympic guy, and he said, "Yeah, we could set that up. I think so." So I was calling people in Russia who would go along with trying to make this happen. Nobody would touch it, especially peace people. They said, if you held such a thing, I wouldn't come because it would make Putin look like he was accepting peace. We don't want Putin to look like he's accepting peace. We want him to look bad. I think that's a really bad sign because, when I used to go to, as a guest to the Soviet Peace Committee, I didn't make any pretense of being favorable to Soviet nuclear weapons because my way was paid. It was just I thought, an important thing to do to keep some kind of conversation going. But no, the desire now is you have to show your integrity by refusing any kind of compromise or any association with the enemy. Do you see that as something happening in the left insofar as you're, that part of the left you're touching the elephant of?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's there is definitely a segment you could call the uncompromising left, folks who refuse to compromise, but they usually are referring to compromises of a political nature within, for instance, the United States or within a particular country. So they are very skeptical of the political process. They're skeptical of the existing political parties. And so there is that kind of uncompromising element. And so if they were, they too would argue that if you engage in lobbying for a particular piece of legislation that, for instance, Donald Trump might sign, then you are giving Donald Trump legitimacy that you wouldn't want to do, in the same way that you wouldn't want to give Putin legitimacy through such a conference. So there's that element of the uncompromising left. But there's another element which would be on the transnational level, which would say, for instance, that we can't negotiate with North Korea because North Korea is a terrible human rights violator, and even sitting down with Kim Jong-un, the head of North Korea, confers a degree of respect and legitimacy to Kim Jong-un, and so therefore we shouldn't have any negotiations, and Donald Trump is making a terrible mistake. And that's a different kind of uncompromising attitude, kind of transnational attitude.
I would say that's stronger.
Yes. Well, that's. I mean, I guess it just depends on what level you're working on. But it both can, I think, can be very have deleterious effects. But but the refusal to engage in any kind of diplomacy, yeah, I mean, that is a stumbling block, I think, for any transnational activism. I can definitely see that this is an interesting and important challenge to bring up. By the way, I understood what the demand was for the first march inside India. Is there a particular demand that they're making?
No, and that is I'm very frankly lukewarm about the whole thing. I was enthusiastic in promoting it early on, and then it became clear that there. I said, "Well, what is your demand?" Violence.
Nonviolence.
Nonviolence is not a demand; it's a method.
Right.
You
Right.
can't. It's like saying, "I demand politeness." I mean, that's not a cause.
Right.
And I've argued with her, and I said, "You really? I mean, there are plenty of things you could say. Even something very broad like sustainable development goals, or climate change, or any number of things that would be people would know what you're about."
Right.
I am very disappointed that it's such a vague thing. My God, I mean, we have like this Greta Thunberg says, the house is on fire. We have so many urgent things to handle, really seriously, that to march around saying, let's all be nonviolent, I think is, well, she says it's to allow for them to, every time they come to a new town, they will have a meeting with everybody they can find and try to elicit from the local people what their issues are and tell them how to work for it. But I don't think that's enough.
Yeah. Interesting.
Mm.
Well, you said that this is the question you ask, kind of the relative lack of international organizing at a time when we need it the most, that you ask at every dinner party. What kind of answers do you get?
I'm thinking. I don't know how to answer that. Basically, I don't think I get any answers. I think most people are probably as puzzled as I am. Will give an answer, like a reason. Your answer is as reasonable as anybody's. Your three categories are pretty much what I would get, and you get some dispute as to which should have primacy. I think a lot of people have actually tried to quantify how much of the voting outcome in particular races could you say was a reaction to financial concerns. Well, a part of the reason I think the financial explanation doesn't completely satisfy me is that Trump's pro-Trump voters had a higher level of income than Hillary's voters.
Yes, I mean, but that's if you average it out. If you look at it in aggregate, that's true. But what that misses is that you have a huge number of supporters of his who have very, very modest income, and then you have a very small number of very, very wealthy people as well. So if you average that out, of course, you get a pretty high level of income. But it conceals the real economic nature of his support. But it's only one element. I mean, the economic explanation is only one element. I mean, people voted for Trump for a variety of reasons. Some of them familiar within the U.S. context, such as a desire for someone who is a new player in the political world who doesn't have any baggage, negative baggage, someone who speaks their mind, who doesn't seem to be controlled by a party and what a party demands politicians say. So, I mean, there are some familiar tropes to explain why Trump in particular was successful. But if we're looking at kind of, the far right more generally, you know, then I think these three interlocking explanations help. But these explanations only help to understand why the far right has been successful. It doesn't explain why the left and left internationalism, right, is weak. And that's really what I'm trying to understand here.
Well, you know, I was on the steering committee of the International Peace Bureau for 3 years, and we would have meetings 3 times a year in Europe. Always a different city. So I saw a lot of Europe in those 3 years. I guess I've been off about 5 years now. And in the meantime, you know, Colin Archer has retired, and they don't even really have central office. I think Rainer Braun runs something out of Berlin, and then there are a couple of people doing things elsewhere. But it seemed, from what I've understood, that even their headquarters doesn't exist. So it's a bad sign. Looking back on my own experience there, I would say that there are you're in a good position to say something about that, because you and Colin, I think, probably together were the 2 authors of the notion of the Global Day of Action Against Military Spending. And that, to my mind, was the only international project that IPB actually sponsored. There wasn't any reason to join IPB because you don't get anything out of it. You aren't part of any really functioning communication system. And to my mind, I kind of got to the point when it's expensive for me to go to Europe every 3 times a year.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel it was worth it, in the sense that when we'd get there, Colin and the 2 co-chairs, one was Thomas Magnusson and one was Ingeborg Brienis then. Those people would have made all the decisions. And then we would have a meeting and ratify their decisions. But there was no energy from or potential for one of the members of the steering committee to initiate anything and have any real influence. What I'm saying, I think, is that organizing actual international projects, campaigns, or even discussions, it's not easy. And I don't know anybody who's done it. Think back to the Helsinki Citizens Assembly. I loved going, and I made friends, although I don't know how many of them I'm still in touch with. And I met you there, and and it was there were good conferences when we put on one. I remember the founding one, in Prague, as a real project or international community. Was it a community? Not really. I think. And I don't know of any group that really is a community. Now, it should be a lot easier with websites available, and people in Canada. There's some listservs where a few nutcases, but some not totally crazy people have frequent discussions of international issues. Project Plowshares has a listserv, 2 or 3 listservs, and so within the country, we know each other. A lot of us know each other, and it's possible to have a discourse on things like listservs.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that it'll be possible to have it on this, website that we've created to save the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Really, I'm pinning all my hopes on that one website.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
For international things. And then let's see if this Zoom, just conversation from people around the world, if I can make that happen.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. No, I hope it is successful. One last question is really, and you've talked a little bit about it, but it's a question I ask everybody, and that is what you think is missing from these transnational efforts to either challenge the far right or to get at some of the issues that the far right has been succeeding on, like on immigration or climate change. And you've talked a little bit about, the importance of community, of building a community, the importance of, technically of bringing people together through the web by Zoom and other methods. What else? What other kind of missing pieces? If I said, Metta, I have access to $3 million that I can give to you as to do your work. What would you spend it on? I mean, what do you think is what are the missing building blocks for a kind of robust, transnational, progressive, multi-issue organizing?
Well, I'm impressed by the new Green Deal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That the notion of putting together certain planks, a platform that everybody should endorse,
Mm-hmm.
is hopeful, because I think the proposals, the policy proposals, people, it's like confetti. There's always stuff going on,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no coherence in general to
Mm-hmm.
what the left expects or demands or needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think building a project, a program, a platform, a list of demands that really comes out of a democratic participatory process should be promising. That's why I organized this thing a little over a year ago, called How to Save the World. It was a 2-day event, and I asked people 6 months in advance to start sending me lists of public policy proposals that we could put on a list, and we collected about 100. And then we had this 2-day event. The first day, the experts gave their thoughts about each of these 6 global threats. And the second day, we had a breakout group and chose out of this 100 policy proposals the ones that we thought would really make a difference. And so we came up with 25. We set a finite limit. 25 had to be short ones that would fit on one piece of paper. Yeah. And so we have this platform for survival. And that I think the point is that there are so many dimensions to our various threats. There's, of course, the 2 big ones being nuclear war and global warming, but then we've got famine, pandemics, radiation, Chernobyl kinds of safety issues about nuclear power and nuclear non-bombs things, and then cyber attacks. And then we have to have, I think, some structural changes, economic and financial and governance structural changes in order to make any of the big proposals realistic. So we include things like basic income and Tobin tax and UN Parliamentary Assembly and a few radical structural proposals that I think would set the stage for some other real ones.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, but it is, so we have this platform, and I think if a number of different social movements, we need a social movement of social movements, you know,
Mm.
different movements. You don't want to weaken or compete with any of the existing NGOs. There are plenty of those doing the right things, but there needs to be more integration of programs of um, organizations working on these separate threats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think unifying them, you know, a unified platform, which people could endorse or not, might do it. It's kind of a hard sell, though. When I
Mm-hmm.
try to explain it to people, I wouldn't say that people's eyes light up.
Well, why is it a hard sell?
Well, I would say almost everybody I know would say this. I'm working my butt off working on global warming or
Mm-hmm.
chemical weapons or whatever. And I can only do so much, and therefore I'm going to concentrate. And you're asking me to diffuse my efforts, and if you have too broad a scope,
Mm-hmm.
you should
Mm-hmm.
focus. Just take one thing and work on that.
Mm-hmm.
And to my mind, that doing those one things, we don't see enough of how we're connected to people working on other things that are also important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I always say that, you know, Isaiah Berlin's The Fox and the Hedgehog.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm a fox because I
Yeah.
don't know much about too many things. I mean, any one thing, but I know a little bit about a whole bunch of things.
Mm-hmm.
And and that's the kind of project that I can do.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's a specialist who focuses on knowing one thing really well and being very, you know, expert. I think more people admire that and think that's what's needed,
Mm-hmm.
and than what I see is needed. What do you think? I mean, maybe my perception is not right.
No, I would agree. I mean, I also am a fox, and so I am very sympathetic to your perspective. But I do think that it is possible, in at least abstractly, to bring foxes and hedgehogs together. That you can design a program in which the hedgehogs continue to focus on their one thing, and the foxes are able to synthesize across these issue areas. But the challenge is that that there isn't an implied consensus among hedgehogs. In other words, they're working on their issue areas, but they don't necessarily agree on some underlying principles, whether it comes to economic reorganization or political reorganization. That's one problem. The second problem is priority. As soon as you start talking about the implementation of any program, you have to talk about priorities. What gets priority treatment? And so obviously every hedgehog's going to say my issue is the priority, but that's not going to work. I mean, you have to choose. So that's where you have conflicts. You have conflicts over the underlying principles, and you have conflicts over priorities.
Well, now tell me about some of those conflicts, because I don't encounter people fighting about who's going to get priority. They just are not aware of each other, and they don't necessarily have any reason to get together or talk.
Well,
in my experience, and maybe you have actually encountered people who have a fight over priorities.
Well, I think you saw it very clearly with the World Social Forum,
Which I haven't followed as closely as I should.
Hmm.
That I understand has come to, well, not a bad end, but it's not flourishing, right?
Right. Well, I mean, it continues to take place. They'll have one next year in Barcelona, but they're beginning to focus much more on sectoral issues, hedgehog issues, if you will, um, rather than trying to be what you said, which is a social movement of social movements. In fact, that's exactly what the World Social Forum was supposed to be, the social movement of social movements. But the problem was that they could not come to agreement on priorities. And the way they got around that was to simply say, well, we're not going to come up with any political statements. In other words, anybody who joined the World Social Forum could organize within the World Social Forum. You know, for instance, there was a lot of organizing around the Iraq War and the demonstrations back in 2003. But the World Social Forum as a body never came out and endorsed those demonstrations. There was never been a call in the name of the World Social Forum for anything, because that was a deliberate decision to preserve this social movement of social movements. Another way of putting that is they refused to prioritize, because that's essentially, you know, what you have to do when you come up with political statements. You have to say, well, this is something we've decided is a priority. We've had a democratic participatory discussion among everybody, and this is what we've decided. But they didn't want to engage in that because it took a lot of time, it created a lot of conflict, and they thought it distracted from the true purpose of just gathering and having conversations. So I think that's the most prominent example of where the priority issue made transnational organizing, frankly, very difficult. But I think in general, you're right. Hedgehogs will just kind of focus on their hedgehog issue, and this issue of priority doesn't come up except within their issue area. For instance, if you focus on climate change, then you have to decide, well, what's the priority that we're going to work on? Methane, CO2, agriculture. I mean, so there are all sorts of priority questions within your hedgehog, silo, if you will. But you don't have to come up with what could be far more paralyzing discussions about priorities across silos. So that I think is the trick of it. It's a trick of it within within nations. So, for instance, it's, I think, easiest to see in Europe because there you actually do have challenges of coming up with priorities within countries and then issues that are transnational in nature within the European space. And there is an opportunity in Europe to, of course, have programs that are trans-European in nature. That's not something that we do here in the United States or Canada, and we don't have a transnational forum for that. And so there you see these same questions of priority, of underlying consensus or lack thereof, and the question of whether one focuses on multi-issues or single issues. And it has, again, looking at the European space, you see that, for instance, they have not been able to come up with effective transnational parties. They have not been able to come up with, except with a few exceptions, the ACTA issue, for instance, around digital privacy. They haven't been able to come up with effective trans-European platforms. And here, when I'm talking about the left, I'm talking about progressives. So again, that's an example of where you really see these conflicts as paralyzing. Something, again, we generally don't have, we don't face in our countries. But I do think that it is possible. It is possible to promote this kind of transnational organizing if you have either a common enemy, number one, or two, a specific venue where you're organizing at. So a common enemy, for instance, were free trade agreements back in the late 90s and 2000s, and to a certain extent even today. But it really brought together people across issue areas when you had the anti-WTO organizing, 99, 2000.
The Seattle thing and so on. Yeah.
Exactly. Or if you have a venue, if you know exactly where you're going to be organizing. So for instance, if you are organizing at the ILO level, there have been some successful campaigns to create new ILO conventions, for instance, on sexual harassment in the workplace. And there you had people working across silos. You had folks working, from the Me Too movement and from unions working together, but they had a very specific place where they were organizing. So I think those are the two kind of examples where you see this kind of transnational organizing take place. To a lesser extent, around arms transfers. So for instance, we've seen human rights activists and peace activists work together to call for an end to arms transfers to Saudi Arabia, for example. And there again, you have a common enemy. You have, obviously, this Saudi government, almost everyone agrees, is a human rights violator. And that allows for people who are ordinarily hedgehogs, who just focus on arms transfers or just focus on human rights issues, to see the value of coming together to focus on something larger.
When you were talking about priorities,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where you got me thinking about, well, you say it's really essential, and I guess that's where I have maybe my head in the sand, in that I don't think we can do that. I think if you do priorities, I don't know, you'll get conflict.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm seeing is not to prioritize, but to have a finite list of proposals that almost everybody can accept.
Mm-hmm.
And with our 25 proposals, some of which are pretty radical, pretty visionary, almost everybody will, well, literally, I think everybody at that conference would accept all of them except for one, and that's nuclear power. The nuclear power issue is extremely divisive, and that's not going to go away. And my recent effort to try to finesse this dispute is to, on our webpage, we say, here are the 25 planks. If your organization can support, say, 20 of the 25, you're welcome to sign it. And we don't ask you to tell which of the ones you are rejecting. So we're just saying, yeah, by and large, we accept this whole package. And if you really didn't want to talk about that, you can go to one of the comments columns and explain why you have your reservations about one or another of them. But my experience with it is that people working in these other silos never thought about the proposals that the other people would come up with, but they don't object to them. So they're happy enough to sign. They're not happy to sign it. They don't care. But if you ask them, could you sign this whole package?
Yeah.
They will say, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't have anything against this other strange idea, but yeah, okay, I can go along with 20 out of the 25. And that, then avoids the whole question of what is it that where do we have real cleavages? And if we did have a meeting, I can tell you for sure exactly what you said is right, because we did. We had a screaming fight, in the second day when we had the breakout groups, and they had to choose which of the planks for their particular threat issue
Mm-hmm.
they wanted to endorse. There was a huge screaming fight, which still the scars are not even healed, about whether when or how quickly to get rid of nuclear power, or whether you really want to build lots of new reactors, and that was a big one.
Yeah.
And I think there were another couple of things where there was some debate, but by and large, it wasn't a matter of which ones we will reject, and but it's which of these excellent proposals we think we want to choose as the most promising.
Right.
And so what I'm trying to do is, and I'm not ever going to hold another meeting. Physically, I use a walker now. I can't do physical things like run around town much. And so I'll never have a get together as a big conference for this project. But what I hope and I try to do is reach out to people in different domains, people, for example, who work on pandemics, the whole community of people working on One Health as an approach. There is a community of people coming together working on the intersection of environmental medicine and tropical medicine and veterinary medicine, all of these areas where global warming means that the habitat is changing things around, and germs live in different places now than they used to, and you have different kinds of contact with. That's a group. Now, linking them into discourse with people about global warming, for example, the people who work on those issues. If I could create a dialogue just between some representatives or experts in these separate communities over those specific areas where they have some common threat, common concern, maybe we have a basis for saying it's knitting the whole thing, the whole system together as a community. I don't know.
Well, it sounds very promising, and I hope that I can help out where I can help out.
Beautiful.
I'm going to I have to run now because I have to go see my brother. But this has been really helpful, Metta.
I think it's fascinating, and it's a huge problem. In fact, I'm glad that we did record this because maybe there's something we can do with it.
I hope so.
Can I? Is it okay with you if I?
Of course, anything I say is on the record.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about this is for posterity, but let's do what we can for posterity.
That sounds good. Thank you, Metta. It was a pleasure. Always a pleasure to
wonderful to talk to you. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.